Hi everyone, my name is Jasmine Arias and my topic is Indigenous historical trauma. This topic is super important to me because I come from a teaching background where I always prioritized having culturally relevant lessons so that way my students can see themselves in the curriculum. And I really hope to continue this practice as a school counselor and implement and create culturally relevant interventions. It's really important for individuals to understand that the ramifications of colonization are still relevant today and affect Indigenous communities. So the Wikipedia article that I contributed to was titled Indigenous Peoples of the Americas. And basically it was an overview of the history, culture, and demographics of Indigenous people worldwide. A glaring problem that I saw with this page is that in the European colonization section, they mentioned population decline and health problems as if it only exists in the past. And there was no mention about how the colonization still impacts Indigenous communities today. So that is where my contribution comes in. Right under the European colonization section, I added a section on Indigenous historical trauma. I used a systematic study, a systematic review, to mention that Indigenous historical trauma is connected and associated with adverse health outcomes. These health outcomes include, but are not limited to, polysubstance abuse, sexual abuse, suicide ideation, and attempts. In this systematic review, there were plenty of studies that did find an association between Indigenous historical trauma and adverse health outcomes. However, there were other studies that didn't find that association. A really important thing to understand about this research is that Indigenous historical trauma is really difficult to define and systematically measure. So many of the studies measured Indigenous historical trauma in different ways, which makes it extremely difficult to compile data on the topic. So I think in order to understand Indigenous historical trauma more deeply, there needs to be a way to systematically measure Indigenous historical trauma. Another thing that I think that Wikipedia should add to this page is resilience research and also interventions and services that are effective to begin the healing process from Indigenous historical trauma. Thank you so much for listening.